welcome to Bioethics Video 2, an overview of the master concepts of this course. The first presentation was just a hello and an overview of the mechanics of this course. Now we are actually going to do bioethics. We are going to talk about philosophy and medicine. The main purpose of this presentation is to introduce you to the 4 ethical concepts I will be using to structure this course and the important role they have not just in our thinking about healthcare, but in the actual work done in the hospitals and clinics that many of you work in or are training to work in. These 4 concepts are autonomy, justice, moral status, and naturalness. A secondary goal of this presentation is to explain why I've chosen these 4 concepts and how they relate to the textbook and other approaches to bioethics. Let's begin by looking at a real-life case in medicine that raises ethical issues. We will be looking at babies born with severe birth defects, and I should warn you that the image that I am about to show is quite graphic. This is a picture of a baby born with anencephaly. Anencephaly literally means having no brain. It is part of a family of birth defects called neural tube defects, all of which involve the failure of the brain or spinal cord to form properly. In the case of anencephaly, the cerebral hemispheres have simply failed to form, although there might be a brain stem that can handle reflex reactions like breathing and some responses to stimuli. Babies born this way are unable to attain consciousness and therefore incapable of feeling pain. Actually, it's a bit more complicated than that. To say definitively that they can't feel pain, we would need to know what consciousness is, and no one really understands consciousness yet. Babies like this generally die within a few hours or days of being born, that is, if they survive the trauma of birth at all. However, with aggressive medical treatment, such a baby can survive for months or even years. In 1992, a woman in Fairfax, Virginia found out that the baby she was carrying would be born anencephalic. Citing her Christian faith, she declined to have an abortion. After the baby, known as baby K, was born, the parents insisted that the hospital take aggressive measures to keep the baby alive. The mother said that she believed that only God could decide when the baby would die. The hospital wanted to provide palliative care only, but the couple went to court and won. Baby K wound up living 2.5 years. So, when a baby is born with anencephaly, we are faced with a complicated ethical decision. Should such babies be kept alive using aggressive treatments? We can see the 4 ethical concepts I want to use in this course at work in this issue. The first concept is autonomy. Who decides what should be done in a case like this? The principle of autonomy says that people should control their own lives. In medicine, this leads to the notion of informed consent. Patients must give their informed consent to any procedure. But baby K obviously cannot give informed consent. So who decides here? This is the sort of question we will be looking at in the first part of this course. The next ethical concept is justice. Justice is usually conceived of as a kind of fairness, and is really a matter of being ethically consistent. One of the sad things about treatment decisions for severely damaged newborns is that laws and hospital policies are really all over the place. Some parents might find doctors refusing to treat a newborn that they want kept alive. Other parents might find doctors insisting on keeping a newborn alive, even though the baby is suffering, and the parents wish that the baby be allowed to die. So, a situation like this can have radically different outcomes based solely on where the baby is born. This raises an issue of justice. which, as we will see, means treating similar cases similarly. The next concept I want to discuss is moral status. This is not an idea that is normally treated directly in medical ethics textbooks, but it is actually crucial for understanding the moral issues we are confronted with in the news, particularly abortion. Baby K was carried to term because the mother did not believe in abortion. Abortion opponents say that they believe that life begins at conception. This isn't the right way to put it, though, because everyone acknowledges that the fetus is alive. For that matter, sperm and eggs are alive. Plants are alive. Microbes are alive. What makes the fetus special in the eyes of an abortion opponent is that it is a person. Personhood is a kind of moral status. If you say that something is a person, you mean that you have duties toward them. You owe it to them to treat them a certain way. And that's what moral status is. Moral status is the status of an object with respect to duties owed directly to it. The last concept I want to look at is a sort of grab bag of intuitions that don't fit into any of the categories normally used by ethics textbooks, but which many people feel very strongly. I'm using the term naturalness to cover these intuitions because they are often expressed by statements like, "That's just unnatural," or you are messing with Mother Nature. Worries about playing God also fall into this category, as does the sentiment expressed by Baby K's mother that only God can decide when Baby K should die. Like moral status, this is not a topic typically directly addressed in medical ethics textbooks. In this case, the reason is that it is very hard to turn instincts into naturalness, instincts about naturalness into philosophically respectable principles. One of the things we will do when we look at the issue of naturalness is to see whether there is even any moral content here. So these are our concepts. First, we will be looking at autonomy, which we will define as a person's right to determine the course of their own life. Next is justice, which we will define as treating similar cases similarly, or giving everyone their due. Justice is a matter of ethical consistency. Next is moral status, the status of an object with regard to the duties owed directly to it. Finally, we will look at naturalness, which we will define as agreement with the inherent, possibly divine order of things. I want to conclude by putting these four basic concepts into a larger context, bringing in some terminology from your textbook and explaining why I chose to build the course around these four concepts. Your textbook opens by distinguishing descriptive or scientific ethics from philosophical ethics. Descriptive ethics just studies how people in fact go about making ethical decisions. It studies ethical views and practices in different times and different cultures, and could be a part of sociology, psychology, or history. We could study our four ethical concepts this way. For instance, we can note, just as a matter of sociology, that Americans tend to value autonomy more than Koreans. This will actually come up later in the course when we will look at surveys that show Koreans are more likely to think it is acceptable for doctors to lie to patients. This is not what we will be doing for the most part in this course, though. As your text says, we are mostly concerned with the philosophical study of ethics, which is first and foremost a normative study. It is a study of what we actually should do. We are not as interested in the question of who thinks it is acceptable to lie to patients as we are in the question of whether it is actually okay to lie to patients. This might seem like too big a question for anyone to answer, but notice it is the one that you will eventually have to answer if you work in medicine. At some point, you will have to confront directly the question of what is the right thing to do. Your text divides the philosophical study of ethics into three parts: metaethics, general normative ethics, and applied normative ethics. Applied normative ethics is the study of what should be done in particular situations that often raise ethical problems. Medical ethics is a part of applied ethics, as is business ethics, engineering ethics, environmental ethics, and a host of other fields. General normative ethics is an attempt to come up with a general theory of how one should live one's life. It is an attempt to come up with an ethical theory of everything. Metaethics is a step even farther into abstract. It asks questions like, why be moral at all? Are there moral facts? And what does it mean for something to be morally good anyway? There's a problem here, though. For most of the history of philosophy in the West, the focus has been on general normative ethics, big theories of how to do everything. A lot of the tools that have been developed were meant to be used at this high level of abstraction. The problem is that these tools don't work very well in a contemporary biomedical context. You'll see this in your text. The process of getting from the general ethical theory to applied ethics is awkward and difficult. The major ethical concepts were developed in general ethical theory seem abstract and empty, and efforts to relate them to the real issues people face seem forced. This is why I have chosen to build the course around the four concepts I chose. These four concepts are concepts that work at the level of applied ethics. By contrast, the two big concepts in general normative ethics, since about the 1800s, have been consequentialism and deontology. These two ideas are all over your text. You're going to need to know a little bit about them in order to understand some of what's going on. So, here's the shortest possible take. The simplest way to think about the difference between consequentialism and deontology is to think about ends and means. The consequentialist holds that the ends sometimes justify the means. This is an idea that Hollywood movies play around with a lot. Should the hero allow Manhattan to be destroyed in order to prevent the destruction of the whole world? The consequentialist says yes. Now, the ends don't always justify the means. You shouldn't nuke Manhattan just to get rid of the rats. But if destroying Manhattan would save more people than it kills, then it's a good idea. This is because the goodness of an action is measured by the total of its consequences. The more good consequences, the better the action. Deontology rejects this whole way of thinking. Deontology says that you shouldn't look at consequences at all. Just look at the act itself and see whether it is something that is morally acceptable. So deontologists tend to say things like, lying is always wrong, even when it would spare people's feelings. As I said, I think these concepts are actually too broad to do a lot of work in bioethics, and this is why I have chosen to keep the discussion at this lower level where it is easier to apply things. Still, you need to know about consequentialism and deontology to navigate much of what has been written in medical ethics. The other thing you need to know is the two leading examples of consequentialism and deontological theories. The consequentialists are typically introduced by a school of thought called utilitarianism, and the deontologists are represented by a German philosopher named Immanuel Kant. These ideas are described in great detail in the introduction to your book. The final set of concepts you will need to know to understand some of the readings are the so-called 4 principles of bioethics. These were established by a government panel in 1978 in a document called the Belmont Report. And they were further developed by philosophers Beauchamp and Childress in an important early textbook in medical ethics. The idea of these principles was to identify some basic ideas that we can all agree on as a starting point for constructive discussions on controversial bioethical issues. So, we begin with the simple principle of non-maleficence, meaning you shouldn't hurt people. This seems like a good starting point, since doctors since the time of the Hippocratic school have been taking oaths to do no harm. The next principle is beneficence. Again, this is a simple idea with ancient roots. The classic version of the Hippocratic Oath has physicians pledge that in every house I enter, I shall tend to the sick and wounded. The next 2 principles are also principles that I'm using in this course, justice and autonomy. These principles bring out the failure of the can we all just get along approach from Beauchamp and Childress. We can all agree that justice and autonomy are good, but we disagree strongly about what counts as justice and autonomy. This will come out in our discussions of paying for healthcare and euthanasia. My approach actually inverts the approach from Beauchamp and Childress. I want to focus on the principles that people disagree on. That's why I have carried over Beauchamp and Childress's principles of justice and autonomy and added 2 more concepts that people interpret differently: moral status and naturalness. The interesting part of the classic 4 principles approach wasn't the stuff we all agreed on. Whenever people appealed to the principles of beneficence or non-maleficence, they didn't wind up saying anything interesting. They were just using big words to describe common sense ideas. But when it came out that people understood justice and autonomy differently, well, that was progress. Understanding why we disagree was actually a step towards agreement. In any case, you'll need to recognize the 4 classical principles to understand what other people are referring to in the text. The 4 guiding concepts of this course, however, are different. Our concepts are autonomy, justice, moral status, and naturalness. Each one of these will get its own section in the course, and we will discuss how different interpretations of them lead to different ideas about practical issues. That's all you need to know for the basic concepts of this course. You have one more video to watch on argument, and then you'll be done with the introductory material and can go on to read about autonomy and euthanasia.